Hello guys, this is CannibalChess. I hope you're having a fairly decent day so far, and today I thought we would just go over the Richard and Hans game from round 7 of the FIDE World Rapid Championship. So, Richard with the white pieces starts the game off with e4. Hans goes e5, just a classic king's pawn opening, and here Richard decides to make it a bishop's opening by bringing his bishop out to c4. And at some point he wants to play d3 to solidify his pawn structure. He just didn't want to play it immediately because if you play d3 here, then your light square bishop is kind of stuck on this less active diagonal. So he goes ahead and plays c4, bishop c4, just to activate his bishop early and kind of eye this weak pawn on f7 as well. So here Hans responds by going knight f6, attacking this undefended e4 pawn. So now Richard responds by bringing his pawn to d3, just solidifying his pawn structure and also making a way for his dark square bishop to come out to possibly d2 or e3 or even g5 would work as well. And Hans here, instead of just pushing something like h6 to defend against a pin, he just kind of says, I don't really care about any pins that you would put on my knight. I'm just going to play knight c6 and get my other knight out as well. And here Richard doesn't try for a pin. He just goes and brings his knight to c3. And I think they're just kind of trying to fight for the center of the board right now. They're not really caring about kind of sidelines ideas of pinning different pieces and stuff like that yet. So Hans here goes for this kind of strange looking move, knight a5. And the idea behind this move is that he's wanting to get this light square bishop off the board as early as possible, because this is kind of the most active piece so far. It's eyeing this weak f7 pawn, and it's kind of on a fairly long diagonal. He also doesn't want to have any trouble castling on the king side. At some point, if he wanted to go f6 or something like that, then it'd be hard to castle kingside. So he goes for the bishop here, and if you notice, any reasonable place that the bishop tries to go to escape this knight, if it goes to b3 or if it goes to d5, both squares, it can be taken by different knights. And if it tries to go to something like b5, that would just be a total mistake after, pawn to c6, and then it would just be pushed back. So here Richard decides to go bishop b3. Hans just simply takes, and then Richard retakes with the pawn. And now he kind of has this semi-open file that he could try and work with, maybe like lift his rook up, possibly to the 5th rank or something like that, or 4th, at some point during the game when it's kind of a good idea to, but he doesn't really mess with this too much. He doesn't really want to try and risk losing his rook or something like that. So he decides to not really mess around with the semi-open file too much. So after Hans goes d6, then Richard just simply pushes f4, striking in the center of the board. And here, when Hans goes d6 here, the computer's saying that d5 would have been a little bit more accurate, striking in the center immediately, kind of pushing for an advantage. And if Richard actually takes here, then it's perfectly fine for Hans after he retakes with the knight, because now Richard can't really take back with his knight. If he did, then Hans would have this very active centralized queen that would also be hitting this weak g2 pawn. So Richard wouldn't really be able to take the knight back, and so Hans would just kind of be controlling the center of the board at this point. So I think that's what the computer's seeing it, and also pushing d5 would make it to where this dark square bishop could come out to b4, and also this light square bishop could come out to e6 as well, but pushing d6 instead makes it to where this dark square bishop can only be kind of activated on e7, so it's less of an active square for the dark square bishop to be on. So after d6, then Richard pushes f4, attacking the center, and here Hans is actually fine just giving Richard a way to activate his dark square bishop. He just doesn't really care that much at this point if the bishop is eyeing this pawn on d6. I mean, Richard does kind of have some options of trying to push e5 at some point in the game after he kind of castles, gets his king safe, but Hans isn't worried about that yet. So Hans continues by bringing his bishop out to the less active square on e7. Richard has the same idea of just getting ready to castle, and the computer's saying here that for Richard it would have been better to bring his queen to f3, and then possibly do something like knight to e2 instead, just slowly developing. But it is also fine to go knight f3. Both moves are almost the same accuracy level. They're both fine moves. So he goes knight f3, and here Hans castles, Richard castles, and now Hans finally pushes d5, striking in the center of the board. And instead of taking, which as I showed earlier might not have been the best thing for Richard to do here, Richard just decides to push the pawn forward, attacking this knight on f6. And Hans decides to, what would look like more of a reasonable move is to go here and then attack the bishop as well. But I think he might not have liked the idea of Richard being able to possibly maybe move his knight to d4 or d2, and then there'd be a discovered attack on the knight after he had moved his bishop back or something. So instead of going knight to h5, he just goes knight e8, and they're both actually almost the same. They're both kind of the same level of accuracy. The computer's saying they're both still like 0.49 or something like that accuracy. So they're pretty much the same level of accuracy. But he's just kind of trying to reroute his knight in the back of the board first, and then get it back out later to become more active again. So Richard continues the game with solidifying his pawn structure, pushing d4, kind of making a little bit more momentum in the center of the board. And now Hans doesn't have any idea of pushing d4 and kicking away this knight from c3 as well. So Hans brings his other let square bishop out to this pretty active diagonal here, and now most of his pieces are pretty much fully active, except for this knight. He just has to reroute it and then get his rooks into the game a little bit more. But other than that, his position is quite solid. The game is still even as well. And Richard here decides to just simply move his king to h1. And I think maybe he's trying to just get it off of the g file to get away from this diagonal possibly, or just make it a little bit more safe in general from any attacks that the queen could have at some point coming down here if the knight and the bishop were to move and stop defending this square. And the computer's liking this move, knight to e1, I think just trying to reroute the knight as well, just like Hans is doing. But okay, he doesn't go for that. He just goes king h1. And Hans just solidifies his pawn structure to the center of the board by pushing c6 here. And this also makes a way for the knight to come to c7 and kind of reroute to possibly e6 as well. Here Richard brings his knight over to e2. I think he's wanting to push these pawns at some point now. He could also potentially try and maneuver his knight over here to g3 as well to attack this bishop. Just some of the ideas in the position here. And Hans does indeed go for a reroute, knight to c7. And here Richard does indeed bring his knight to g3 to attack this bishop on f5. Hans not wanting to give up his bishop, the computer suggesting that he kind of does in a way. If he moves here, then Richard could probably just take the bishop, and it'd be a little bit better for Hans, but it'd be all right for Richard as well. But Hans not wanting to give Richard that option, he just simply moves back with the bishop. He kind of enjoys this long diagonal that the bishop is hitting. And here Richard just simply pushes this pawn to c3. So this light square bishop is no longer hitting it, and now the queen doesn't have to worry about just defending this c2 pawn from the bishop all the time. And Hans finally maneuvers his knight back into the game by way of e6, and now he's hitting Richard's bishop. So Richard just simply drops it back, and the reason for all of these, they're trying to save their bishops, is because it's usually better to have a bishop than a knight in the middle game. So that's their reasoning behind not wanting to give their bishops up, which makes total sense. And Hans finally decides to try and push for an advantage here by pushing f5. And if Richard decides to not take with en passant here, then Hans could have some ideas of bringing the pawn down and kind of forking the bishop and the knight. So it's probably better to take here. The computer's saying it's better to take than to go something like knight to, the computer's saying knight to e1 would work to defend against a pawn push. I think a more reasonable human move would be to move knight e2 to just get one of the pieces out of the way, and then after this is pushed, then get the other one out of the way. But better would be to just en passant here and take away the attack altogether. So that's what Richard does. It's the best move. And here Hans kind of activates his dark square bishop a little bit more, gets on more of an active diagonal, and also makes it to where after the bishop moves back or moves forward, then this rook has a little bit more of an open file as well to work with. So Hans is very happy here. He's kind of enjoying a little bit more of an advantage than Richard is. His pieces are a little bit more active. His bishops are on very active diagonals here. So he's enjoying his position very much. And here Richard just simply pushes b4. And he's trying to keep Hans from pushing on the queen side a little bit more. He's trying to make a little bit more of a... he's trying to give Hans a hard time pushing for more advantage on the queen side. And here Hans, he instead of just going passive a6, which the computer is suggesting, just to play it slow, he wants to go ahead and attack Richard's pawn structure as fast as possible. So instead of pushing the pawn would probably be a big mistake, because then after you just take, and then you'd have two pawns that could march down the board. So you wouldn't want to just push the pawn. You don't really want Hans to take the pawn either, because then you still have a doubled pawn structure. So instead, Richard just decides to take, and this also fixes his pawns. He doesn't have any more doubled pawns on the b file, so he's pretty happy with this trade. And here Hans just takes the pawn, Richard takes back, and now Richard gets these pawns that are not doubled anymore, but Hans also enjoys this pretty active queen on a5, and now he has some ideas of going after this pawn on b2 and kind of messing with Richard's secure pawn structure here. And if you look, it's actually interesting that it's actually a very symmetrical position up until this point. All the pawns are on the same file, the bishops and the knights and the rooks are on the same file, and the kings would have been on the same file if he hadn't moved to h1, and the queens were also on the same file a move ago. So it's kind of an interesting thing just to see how accuracy also affects the structure of the position, because this game had very high accuracy. It was like Richard had like 91% and then Hans had like 96%, so it was a very accurate game. Okay, so back to the game. Richard brings his knight to the center of the board, just knight e5, trying to centralize the knight, also go after this bishop on g6, and here Hans is fine, just finally giving up the knight or giving up the bishop for the knight. And I think his idea here is to just mess up kind of Richard's kind of secure pawn structure. So before Richard takes the bishop, he decides to trade rooks, because after the bishop moved, then this file was open for the rooks to attack each other. So Hans takes, Richard takes, Hans takes back with a knight, and then here Richard just simply continues the game by taking the bishop on e5. And Hans is actually still better here, surprisingly, because I think this pass pawn gave him a little bit more of counterplay on the king side of the board for Hans. But also something that Hans has going for him is this more active queen, and also that Richard kind of made the mistake of moving his king to h1, because now he has to continue defending this entire rank, because he doesn't want to get checkmated on a1 or something like that. So he probably should have created some lift at some point just to make it to where his king could escape. And Hans, you kind of notice his king can come to f7 at any time and just escape any ideas of back rank checkmate. So his position is just a little bit more better than Richard's here. But okay, after Richard retakes with the pawn, now Hans decides to finally go after this weak b2 pawn. And here Richard just simply defends by moving queen c1, which is a fine move. I think the computer is suggesting he goes something like queen to e2 to defend the pawn, but I think he didn't really like the idea of just giving Hans control of the rank that the king's on, so he just keeps the queen on the first rank. And here Hans just he tries to bring his queen to a little bit more centralized square. He doesn't really want these pawns to start marching forward to mess up his pawn structure, so he kind of stops them. And he also doesn't want b3 to be played, so now Richard can't really play b3 because then he would just take. So different ideas in the position here that he's going for here. The computer is suggesting that he just bring his knight out. You know, he's fine with just keeping the queen accountable for this pawn's safety here, and then just bring out his other piece that needs to be reactivated to defend these squares and to try and make more trouble for Richard here. But queen c4 is also a fine move. Computer saying it's an excellent move. And here Richard just simply brings his queen to an open file. So he wants to try and attack Hans' king at some point as well. If the knight decides to move, he's trying to make it to where the knight can't really move, because then he would be attacking Hans' king. And here Hans just simply pushes h5, and he's trying to create trouble for Richard's king side here, just mess up where his knight is, just his knight placement, stuff like that. And he's creating quite good counterplay actually by pushing h5. This is an excellent idea by Hans here. And so Richard responds by he kind of misses the defense, and he kind of costs himself the game at this point by just carelessly bringing his queen up here. And the computer is suggesting something like queen f1 would have been better. He's wanting to get Hans to trade queens. That would have been a good thing for Richard, because Hans' queen here is very active and Richard's is not as active. It's not really attacking the king as much, because Richard's king is a little bit more vulnerable than Hans' king. And yeah, this would have been fine if Hans had tried to push now. Then Richard would have just taken Hans' queen, and then after takes back, then he can just move his knight to any square. Would probably have been fine, except for these two. So that's what the computer is saying would have been a better option, but instead Richard just brings his queen up to the 8th rank, and now Hans has this pretty good move of moving d4. And so this is just, it looks kind of strange actually, because it looks like you're just giving away this pawn for free, but it's not actually just giving away a pawn, because after Richard takes the pawn, looks like for free, then now Hans has this push to h4, and Richard tries to create some sort of counterplay by trying to attack Hans' queen here, but after the queen just simply moves here, or even if the queen takes, is perfectly fine as well. But I think Hans is just trying to stay away from any trouble by taking the pawn. So he just moves the queen to this open file here. And now Richard tries again to create some sort of counterplay, but Hans is fine with just capturing the pawn. And now Richard still has to worry about this knight being attacked. And here he just simply moves his queen, and it's kind of an odd kind of defense he's trying to defend, but it doesn't really work very well here. He's trying to create like an attack on the g7 pawn to try and threaten checkmate, but after queen to e1, there's really no chance of checkmate on g7 for Richard, because now Richard has to defend against this back rank checkmate, so he has to bring his bishop here, and now there's no help in taking this g7 pawn. So the queen can't really take the pawn on her own now, because then the king would just take back. So the bishop kind of has to stay here to kind of keep the king safe, and now Hans just simply takes the knight for free, and now he's up a piece, and Richard's position is just, it's kind of bad. His queen is got a little bit more active, but it's not really doing much to attack the king. The king is perfectly safe. There's no way for the queen to even get on this diagonal fast enough to try and create attacks on Hans' king as well. So there's really no way of defending this position for Richard at this point. So here he just simply resigns the game, because there's no real reason of going on after this. The computer is saying that Hans is up by like 3.5. So he's completely winning in this position. And I believe at this point in the tournament, Magnus is still leading, I think, with like 6 points, or maybe that was a little bit earlier in today's games. But I believe he is still leading as well. But Hans, I think this was like one of his first wins in the tournament. He did draw a few games yesterday, I believe, but this was a very solid win from him, especially beating someone that's like, 50 ELO points above his. So it was a very solid win. Richard is like, I believe he's 14th in the world. So it's a very solid win for Hans here. And I do hope that he continues doing well in the tournament. But yeah, that was the game, Hans and Richard. I hope y'all enjoyed this game and got something valuable out of it. And I hope y'all liked the video. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.